This is Debt Free in 30, where every week we take 30 minutes and get practical advice from industry experts about personal finance and living debt-free. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
Over the years, I've had many clients who got into debt as a result of fraud. In many cases, it was preventable. They lent their credit card to someone and gave them their PIN, and that person used their card and didn't pay them back. Unfortunately, if you give away your PIN, the bank won't cover your losses. We've talked about that before on this show, including with Kelly Keene back on show number 75, so I'll put a link in the show notes to that podcast so you can go back and listen to it if you missed it. But what happens when I don't give my card to someone and fraud still happens? Today in Canada, our credit cards have chips, so fraud at the store is much less likely than it was in the past. But what happens when you use your card to make an online purchase? If I'm buying something at an online retailer, I don't use my chip. I just type in my card number and other information, and that's one reason why online fraud is more common than fraud at a store. It's called card not present fraud, because of course the physical credit card and the chip is not present for that transaction. So other than the fact that you don't use the chip on your card when you make an online payment, why is it so hard to prevent online credit card fraud? How do merchants protect themselves? More importantly, what can you do to protect yourself when you're making purchases online? Those are the questions I have for my guest today, so let's get started. Who are you and who do you work for?
I'm Rafael Lourenco. I'm the Executive Vice President for ClearSale. And ClearSale does fraud prevention for card not present transactions, meaning that we stop fraud before it happens for transactions done mainly online, mainly with situations in which somebody is buying but is not present on the process of buying. So companies like Walmart, Sony, Chanel, and a bunch of others are our customers, and we'll help them with this process of preventing from fraud.
And card not present is exactly what it sounds like. If I go to a bricks and mortar merchant with my card, I put it in the machine, I punch in my PIN. But if I'm buying something online, which is what you're talking about, obviously my card is not present. I can't punch it in. That's what you're talking about with card not present. Is that right?
Correct. So the biggest difference between these two scenarios that you just described is the financial liability. Right. So when it comes to transactions on brick and mortars or card present transactions, as we like to describe, this financial liability for eventually a transaction that is not recognized by the card holder is on the bank's or the card issuer's side. While when you're talking about a card not present transaction, which is mainly online or modal or phone orders, then the financial liability, meaning the company responsible for paying the reimbursement that the customers is owed, is the merchant. So the company, whoever it was, that let the transaction go through.
And so as a consumer, do I even care then? So, I mean, if it's the bank's problem, then, what do I care? Is this something that as an individual consumer I need to worry about?
Okay, so there's a few aspects. Obviously, when you have your credit card involved in a fraud, there will be different levels of how easy it is to get your money back, right? So you're going to call your card issuer as a consumer if you see a transactions on your invoice that you don't recognize. And if that's a card not present transaction, it tends to be easier for you to get your money back. And the reason why is that the company you're calling to, which usually is the bank, is not responsible financially for that fraudulent order. So they will probably only let you go and give your money back and then ask this money back from the merchant. However, it doesn't mean that it's 100% seamless for you, this process, because obviously you have to issue another credit card, probably your credit card number, and very likely other personal information about yourself is being used by a fraudster. So ultimately, you are being involved in a crime. So I'd say that financially speaking, in the super short term, yes, you shouldn't care that much. But obviously, conceptually speaking, I'd say there's a lot of more involved in a situation like that you should be aware of as a consumer.
Yeah, so even though I may not suffer a financial loss, it's still a huge pain in the butt. I got to get a new card, go through all the hassles. So, reset up all my pre-authorized payments, whatever. So it's something as a consumer
correct.
I want to be aware of as well. So how big a problem is fraud, and specifically the kind of fraud that you're dealing with, card not present fraud? How big a problem is it?
Yeah, it's a huge problem, and and mainly it's a growing problem, right? So and it involves many aspects of a business as well as a consumer's point of view. In the business point of view, you're talking about mainly two sources of losses for a business. The first one mainly and more obvious in the first layer is the losses with fraud. So an average North American merchant loses on average 0.9%, meaning 90 basis points of its revenues in chargebacks, in fraudulent losses, right? So it's a little less than 1%. But if you look at this on the point of view of, it sounds like a small percentage, but if you look at it at a point of view of the margins, retailers tend to have margins from 4 to 8%. It's not a big margin business. So if you're losing 0.9 out of a margin of 4 or 5%, you're talking about more than 10% of your margins going away with fraud, with a specific type of loss, right? And that's a big problem. Secondly, what could be actually a bigger problem than that is many retailers will be afraid of losing this amount of money, and eventually will implement systems, rules, policies, whatever, to block some orders, to avoid this cost to happen. And when they do that, eventually they won't do it properly, and they will block transactions that shouldn't be blocked. So somebody as a consumer may have been declined by a certain merchant because they implemented a system that is very conservative. And that's a much bigger problem. So talking about the United States, for example, there are some researchers that say that it's a $9 billion problem, the problem of fraudulent chargebacks. While if you talk about false declines, that are those orders that should be approved but weren't because of fear of fraud, it's a problem of $113 billion in potential revenue that is blocked, that didn't really happen as revenue. So mainly those are the two biggest problems on a merchant's point of view.
Yeah, and obviously that's annoying for me as a consumer if I'm placing an order online and all of a sudden it gets blocked for some reason. I don't even know what the reason is, and I'm all upset. Now I don't like the retailer and I got to go somewhere else. So obviously it's a problem for everyone. So why is it then that it is so difficult to prevent this type of fraud?
Well, yeah, first, you're completely right. As a consumer, 34% of the consumers in a recent research report that they would never buy again in the same merchant if its credit card is declined, especially because many consumers won't have a clear view of why the transactions was declined, and eventually will relate it to a credit issue or to something that the merchant believes the person can't pay or is not good enough for the merchant. So the feeling is not really good on the consumer.
What percentage did you say?
34% report that will never buy again, and another 32% report that would reduce their usage of credit card in this particular merchant. So more than 60% of them will make some different behavior after that happening.
Yeah, and I can certainly understand that because so I go online, I try to purchase something, and all it says is declined. It doesn't give me a whole reason for it. And so I'm thinking, oh boy, my credit's bad, or they think my credit's bad. So it's annoying for me as a consumer. It's upsetting. But yeah, now I'm really mad at the retailer, because who else can I be mad at? Or maybe I'm mad at my bank as well. But it's a problem. And as a result, I can see, okay, I'm not going back to that retailer. So it's obviously a huge problem. So why is it so difficult to prevent this kind of fraud?
Well, I think there are two main sources of how hard or of reasons why it's hard to prevent from this type of fraud. First is that as time goes, as the technologies are developed, the merchants and the providers, just like ClearSale, they count with less and less information in that moment, right? Because people are less and less likely to share information on a certain purchase. So think of the purchases doing through your cell phone. You don't want to feel like dozens of forms, or you don't want to share a lot of information about yourself. You just want to buy something online. Sometimes you're buying something through an app on your cell phone, and you don't even want to type. It's hard to type everything up. So merchants are requiring less and less information from the consumers, and that's a trend that I wouldn't doubt. I wouldn't fight against it, because everybody's willing to make a purchase the easiest they can, so that they can sell more and the consumers can have a more convenient way of buying. So the absence of information is one of the sources of one of the reasons why it's so hard. On the flip side of that, you have the fraudsters also involving when it comes to their techniques. So the data breaches, for instance, are an important piece of this puzzle. So once Equifax or Target or any of those famous data breaches that happened in the recent years happen, then basically your data or the data of a big number of consumers is out there waiting for being used by someone, right? So when a fraudster has access to a combination, for instance, of a credit card and an address, or an email address and phone number, then it's much easier for the fraudsters to pretend to be somebody else. Because in the end of the day, when you are talking about this type of fraud, we are talking about identity theft, right? Mm-hmm. It's somebody. The fraudsters usually won't use their own credit card. Obviously, they will use somebody else's. And the data breaches, as I said, is an important part of that, because it's easier for a fraudster point of view. In a fraudster point of view, it's easier to access a combination of data, and therefore it's easy to pretend to be somebody else. So if I have your name, your shipping address, your email address, then I just have to fill those items, and I'm going to be pretending to be yourself. And it's going to be hard for the merchants to avoid that, or to understand that order as suspicious, because everything is matching.
Yeah, and I hadn't really thought about that, but you're right. A lot of people now are buying things on their phone. It's not like I'm going on my desktop computer and I've got lots of time to fill in all the different forms and everything. So, and the reason I'm doing it on my phone, obviously, it's way easier. It's an ease of use. Do you think we've sacrificed some security for ease of use to make it easier? There's only one or two buttons I click now and not many. Is that a problem that we've got now? We've traded security for ease of use?
I'd say that depends on your point of view, right? If you're a merchant and you want to sell more, then obviously it's a trade-off that you may want to take. But in the end of the day, yes, you're right. Like the less information you ask, the harder it is to prevent from some type of fraud. So the more you need technology suppliers or whatever to develop and to design a fraud prevention strategy that accommodates this new scenario. But it's two sides of the same coin. So I'd say that somehow some merchants may have sacrificed the security and the name of the ease of use. For instance, the one-click buy is the perfect example. So when your credit card is loaded on the website, already loaded, and you don't even need to type it again or to type the security 3 digits, the CVV as they call. Anybody that hacks your account online will have instant access to your credit card. So the one click buy is the perfect example of something that makes your life much easier as a consumer, but opens a new opportunity for fraudsters.
And I want to come back to that, but I also want to ask you then, is fraud more common with e-commerce transactions than with a normal bricks and mortar store? I mean, obviously there's no such thing as one-click buy when I'm standing at a cashier. Is it more secure in a bricks and mortar store, or is it about the same?
I'd say percentage-wise, the card not present is riskier, and especially on countries or regions or merchants that adopted the chip and PIN code for the orders, because it's much harder to duplicate a credit card with a chip and understand or figure out what's the PIN code, the password, versus just knowing the 16 numbers of a credit card and the expiration date. That basically it's what is required for a card not present fraud. So yeah, I'd say that card not present orders are riskier.
Now, your company, ClearSale, operates across the world, right? You're based in the United States,
Correct.
but as a Canadian, if I'm purchasing something online, there's a very good chance that your software, your program is being used by the retailer I'm using. Is that correct? It's
correct. Yeah.
Okay. So what differences do you notice between Canadians and Americans? Is fraud more prevalent in one country over the other? Are there any differences in patterns that you see in Canada as compared to the United States?
Mm-hmm. So good question. I think they differ in a number of dimensions, let's say. But the most important one, or the one that I think is more is easier to understand or to realize, is that Canada, different from the U.S., is being using the technology of chip and PIN for a longer time comparing to the U.S. So October 2015 was the date the initial date for in which the transactions with no chip in the brick and mortar were initiated to be on the merchant's responsibility instead of on the bank's responsibility for the card present orders, for the card present transactions in the United States. So I think the number one difference between the countries is that, I mean, when you're talking about card present orders, Canadians are much more used to the chip and PIN, which is, let's say, a more modern technology comparing to the magnetic that the Americans are used to. And this scenario has consequences to the card not present orders. And the main consequence is that the Canadian market is a little riskier comparing to the American market. And that's a fact that you wouldn't expect because of other reasons.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds crazy to me because, okay, so we're more likely in Canada to be using the chip and the PIN, and I know that for a fact because every place I go, you put your card in, you punch in the code. And we've been using it for a lot longer than the U.S. You said it was only October 2015 that the responsibility switched to the merchants, so they're obviously a little more proactive now. So if we have better security and have been using it longer, why is Canada riskier or more likely to be subject to these kind of fraudulent transactions?
Yeah, the thing is, when you make it harder for a fraudster to make a fraud in a card-present transaction, you kind of push those people because they are kind of professionals, right? They take their money from this fraudulent activity, so they will go more to the card-not-present orders. So when I say that Canada is riskier, what I mean by that is that on card-not-present orders, there will be more fraud in Canada comparing to the U.S. And my my theory is that one of the reasons is the fact that the chip and PIN is more adopted, so therefore it's harder to make a fraud in the card present orders. So that's the why I think for card not present orders, it's riskier. Canada is a riskier market than the U.S.
And it's just because if I'm a fraudster, I know that, well, I don't have a whole lot of hope of, replicating a card because I can't replicate the chip and the PIN and everything. So I'm not going to put any effort into that. I will put all my effort into the card not present type of fraud. In other words, online transactions and things like that. So it's not that there's any difference in the technology for card not present when it comes to the Canada or the US.
No.
It's just that that's where, and again, this is your theory. Obviously, you're not a fraudster, so you don't know for sure. But your theory is that that's where they're devoting all their attention, and that's why it's slightly more risky here in Canada than the US.
Correct. There's another small difference between those two countries that I may mention. That is the likelihood to be a victim of fraud, of international fraud. So when it comes to our customers, and we have several customers out of Canada and another good number out of the United States, you will see a larger attack or a larger percentage of fraud attempt coming from other countries besides the original country of the merchant on the U.S. versus the Canada. What I mean by that is that perhaps the U.S. merchants are more likely to be targeted by international fraudsters than a Canadian customer, which kind of balances with the other difference that I mentioned on the technology side. So both of them are targeted by international fraudsters. So frauds coming from international IPs, international credit cards, etc. But comparatively speaking, the U.S. is more attacked or more attempted. There are more fraud attempts coming from international sources comparing to the Canada.
Which kind of makes sense because the U.S. is 10 times bigger. There's 10 times as many merchants. I guess there's more to steal. So that's probably another factor in it. Do you have any idea how much higher chargebacks are in Canada as compared to the United States then?
So the numbers are not, they don't converge necessarily, but combining all the different sources, I'd say around 20 to 30% riskier, the Canadian transactions.
So Canadian transactions are 20 to 30% riskier for the merchants when you're talking about card not present transactions.
Yeah. Versus America. Yeah.
Versus America for the reasons you just talked about. Okay. So my final question then is, if I am a consumer and I'm worried about fraud, what should I do? And you've explained it quite well that in most cases, if there is a fraud, it's going to be my bank, my credit card company that's got to pick up the tab or the merchant. So it doesn't really affect me directly. But if I do get defrauded, then at the very least, I probably have to get a new card and, maybe I'm not going to be using that merchant anymore. So there's a lot of hassle involved, and who knows, it may end up having some impact down the line on my credit. I mean, if I got defrauded by, some family member and, it's still considered to be a legitimate transaction because I gave someone my PIN or something, then obviously I'm still on the hook for it. But in the case of the pure types of fraud that we're talking about, and again, I guess I'm speaking specifically about the card not present types of fraud, what as a consumer should I be aware of? What should I be doing? How can I at least lessen the risk that I'm going to have to go through this hassle?
Sure. So I think there's a few quick tips or a few advices, let's say, I could provide. The first one is obviously the fact that sharing credit card information is never a good idea. So even if you trust on somebody or whatever relationship we have with somebody, sharing this information, it's a very personal information. And I'd say that it's not recommended for you to, by any means, share this info, especially take notes of that in a piece of paper or any way that your credit card 16 digits is available, may be used by somebody on a non-legitimate order. A second thing
So
that I
just
would mention.
just on that, so
Yeah,
just
sure.
on that point, then. So if I want to share my credit card with my my son, my a family member or something like that, then I guess either don't share it, or number two, I guess you could always get a secondary card with a completely separate number,
exactly.
with a completely perhaps a lower credit limit or something. So here you go, you can use this card. It's only got $1,000 limit on. The most I can possibly be scammed for then is $1,000, but you don't have access to my card and all my numbers. So
correct.
It's
so easy to make a new credit card that I'd say that it's much safer to make it a really personal info, right? So you have yours, your son or daughter has another one, your wife or whoever has a third one. So it's easy to get multiple cards, and I think we should use that prerogative.
Okay. So don't share your credit card information. I interrupted you there. What were your other piece of advice then?
So if you're involved somehow, I think it's possible to find online lists of compromised data. And if you're involved somehow in those situations, in those data breaches, etc., then there will probably happen a phenomenon in which your orders that you legitimately made online or any other type of order or any type of transaction, they will be more likely to be flagged as risky, right? Because somebody whose data was utilized or compromised in a data breach is more likely to be targeted by a fraudster than not. So if you're a consumer and you somehow have you think for some reason you were involved in a data breach, or your credit card or your personal info is out there available for fraudsters, you will be more likely to be flagged as a risky order, even if it's yourself doing the order. Therefore, the merchant might eventually want to call you or to get in touch somehow. So even though that consumers in Canada and North America in general are not used to that process, perhaps you will receive a phone call to confirm some data, to match, to confirm if you were the one who made the purchase. And that might come from a phone from a phone you don't know. But in that case, I recommend you to take the phone and not avoid this call, because that's what's gonna help you receiving your purchase in the end of the day. So obviously, if you receive a phone call that might sound suspicious or might sound somebody making questions about your personal info, you don't want to respond right away. You're going to make sure that the person knows exactly what purchase you did. So, for example, if ClearSale is calling someone on behalf of one of our clients, I will say, hello, my name is Rafael. I'm calling on behalf of Walmart.com, just as an example, and I want to confirm some data. If you're receiving a phone call like this, there's a chance that it's a ClearSale call or whatever, or a call coming from a merchant. You as a consumer should, one, take the call. I think it's for your benefit, and two, confirm, wait for a confirmation on the merchant side first. So the question is not going to be what's your birth date or what's your credit card number. The question will be more likely to be, is your credit card the final four numbers of your credit card 4651 or whatever, and then you're going to say yes or no, and then the person on the other side of the line will know what good you just bought, how much it costed, etc. So receiving those phone calls is something that consumers are not they don't like usually, but it's usually a part of a process to avoid the order to be declined. So my second tip is understand that this is a reality. The more the fraud rates grow, and the fraud rates are growing a lot, the more likely you are to receive a phone order like this.
And I guess the key in what you said there was you're going to be answering yes or no questions. You're not going to be actually providing information. And certainly here in Canada, there's been huge issues in the past with scams from Canada Revenue Agency, and I assume you probably have the same thing with the IRS in the States, people calling up saying, oh, yes, I'm with the government, and please confirm your social insurance number or your social security number or something for me. And obviously you never want to be giving that kind of information out. But if you just made a purchase in your example at, Walmart online, and someone calls and says, we're calling on behalf of Walmart and we are confirming that you just made a purchase, did you just make a purchase? Yes or no? Is this the last 4 digits of your credit card? Yes or no? Those are yes or no questions. So your advice is, you can answer yes or no questions. Just don't be providing any additional information. That's the key there, I guess.
Yeah, correct. Exactly. 100% agreed.
Okay, cool. And any other tips then for consumers to protect themselves?
Well, I think the 2 ones that I just gave are good enough, and I'd say that my final comment is that any time you as a consumer understand or feel or have your purchase declined, which is the other side of the same coin, right? So sometimes you're a victim of fraud, but sometimes you're declined in a merchant that you did make a purchase. You did make a purchase, but the merchant had the understanding that you didn't, right? So, in one hand, yes, you gotta try to understand that is probably part of a conservative fraud prevention strategy. But on the other hand, I recommend and encourage anybody that suffers with that problem that reports it somehow to the merchant, because in the end of the day, we want the market as a whole to be better than it is, right? So, if you as a consumer were declined in an order, then report to the merchant, so the merchant will understand they made a bad choice, and further for you or other consumers, they will make better choices.
Excellent. And I think that's a very good point. We want the ease, but we also want the security, right? And so if there are glitches in the computer algorithm that's rejecting your purchases, then by all means, speak up, talk to your bank, talk to the merchant and say, hey, I think you've got your algorithm tuned a little too tightly here. And hopefully that can correct the problems in the future. So, well, that's fantastic. That's excellent advice there, Raphael. And I think that kind of helps us a bit more understand. I hadn't really thought through the difference between a card not present and a card present transaction, although now that you've explained it, it's quite obvious. So once again, your company name is ClearSale, and so if anybody is listening who's actually a merchant, because that's who your customers are, right? It's merchants, Correct. It's banks, that sort of thing. And you operate, all around the world, so not just in the United States, but in Canada as well. So if there are any merchants who are listening to this and are going, that's something maybe we should consider, because we seem to be, doing more stuff online and getting hit with more fraudulent transactions. What's the website people can go to find more information out about your company?
So thanks for this opportunity to share that. We are on the website clear.sale. And down there, you can see a lot of content, not only the chance of getting in touch with us, but our blog, .clear.sale, is full of information, just both for consumers and merchants, about e-commerce in general, about card not present orders. So we are a very content-driven company, and in the end of the day, we want to make the market better for everybody. So whether if you're willing to have an online store or you already have it, and you want to know more about e-commerce and card not present fraud, blog.clear.sale is a good source of information, hopefully.
Excellent. Fantastic. Well, I will put a link to that in the show notes as well, but that's a pretty easy address, clear.sale, S-A-L-E.
Correct.
Clear, C-L-E-A-R, obviously, clear.sale, and there's lots of information there. Well, Raphael, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I think that's some fantastic advice. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you, Doug, and hope to talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
That was my conversation with Raphael Lourenco of ClearSale, a company that helps merchants around the world detect and prevent fraud from card not present transactions. I wanted to have Raphael on the show because most of my guests here on Debt Free in 30 are guests that explain everything from the consumer's point of view. That's great, but learning about fraud from the merchant side of the transaction gives some great insights on how we can protect ourselves. I agree with Raphael's advice. Don't share your credit card information with anyone. If you want to give someone else access to your card, like one of your kids or a relative, get a separate credit card with a separate account number for them so that you can minimize your liability. Second, you should decide what's more important to you, security or convenience. If you buy a lot of stuff from one retailer, perhaps it makes sense to store your credit card and other information on their website so you can take advantage of one-click ordering so you don't have to enter your information each time. But of course, that's a greater security risk, so again, you should decide whether you are willing to take that additional risk for the added convenience. No data is completely safe. And even if your bank protects you from fraud, if your credit card is compromised, it's a hassle to get a new card with a new number and reset up any automatic payments, so avoiding fraud is always the best answer. That's our show for today. As always, full show notes, including a full transcript of today's show and a link to everything we talked about, and a link to Raphael's company, and links to our previous podcasts on fraud can be found at hoyes.com. That's HOYES.com. Thanks for listening. Until next week, I'm Doug Hoyes. That was Debt Free in 30.